So if we can find our seats and stuff, I know people are still doing kids and everything, but I wanted to introduce myself. And a lot of you I know, and some of you I don't know, but my name is Brandon Worsham, and I work with Focus over at UT Dallas and have for over 25 years now. And so I did a class for our students back in the spring, I think, and so they asked me to come and share a piece of this. So, happy to be here today. I think I got the short end of the stick, though, because I get to try to exegete all of the difficult passages that cause this to be a confusing issue for us. And in the time I have today, I can really only get you started, and so I would include you to do some Googling, learn a little bit about Greek and all these kinds of challenging things. So we're talking about, in light of this biblical history, this bigger narrative, what does it look like to sort of read these letters? Because all of our problematic passages that we're gonna, and problematic I just mean in the sense that they create dissonance with this bigger story that we're talking about, are letters that we have in the New Testament. and for the most part, all the texts we're going to look at today are specifically from the Apostle Paul. And so the first thing we have to talk about is just what does it mean that the letters are ad hoc? And so ad hoc means that they were created or done for a particular purpose, or that they were sort of written as necessary. And it means that these letters were not written to us directly. Even though we believe, and Christians have believed for 2,000 years, that the Bible was written for us, it was not originally written to us. And that's kind of something that I think growing up in church and growing up in a very conservative kind of church, I know my youth lessons and stuff, I don't think we did a good job of engaging with that. We sort of read each thing as if it was about me. Now, we didn't always do that. We kind of applied that inconsistently at times. And so sometimes we would dig more into the background, like we would learn about shepherds or something because we didn't know anything about shepherds. But so it's in some places we felt like we needed to understand some background information to understand the scripture. But then other passages, if they sort of made sense to us on the surface, it was like, nope, no background or extra reading needed. But I think the challenge for us is, if this is how God decided to write his Revelation book for us, that he did it through these personal letters, that were written 2,000 years ago, and he could have done it a lot of other ways. He could drop a new book out of heaven for us each generation, and we would like that. But if this is the way that God decided to do it, what does it look like for us to take that seriously? That he did this in a certain time and place. Remember also as we do this that all of the chapter and verse numbers, all of those headings that your translation puts in, those are all later additions. And they actually get in the way a lot of times. They're helpful to us for sure, very helpful. But when it comes time for sort of serious Bible study on things, they can get in the way from us. They distract us from reading things in context, because we get to a new number. It's like, oh, I'm done with 1 and now we're on 2. That must mean I'm at a new topic or a new thing. And so we start reading these things that were originally whole letters or whole books, and we read them in these little segments like they were delivered as, little units, but they weren't. And often, so much so that we often don't even know the context of what we're reading. We have very little knowledge of that. It's not just that I'm not thinking about it in the moment. It's just that I don't even have access to it. I haven't done that kind of work. And so the 4 or 5 texts we're going to look at today are ones I think where thinking about them in context does have some significant impact. And then the last thing I want to say before we dive in is just that there are some significant translation issues in these texts. We can't, languages do not port easily one-to-one. You know, that we have ideas and concepts in one language that we don't really have something for in the other. And sometimes we have a lot more ideas for something in one than the other, a lot more ways of saying something. There's all sorts of translation issues that most of the time don't matter a whole lot. We're able to kind of capture. But when we get to a muddy issue like this, I'll try to just sort of point you to some of the challenges that, and this is not to throw stones at translators because they do amazing work, but they just have a big task. And how do I convey something from one language? And also, these translators are, just like us, removed from this situation by geography, by a couple of thousand years. And so they're having to do their best, but they are making choices. And those choices tell us something about their own biases and stuff. So let's look at these texts. All I gave you in your notes are the texts themselves. I think Mark did us in the NIV. And I just want to, at some points I may point you to a broader context, but let's look at them now. So I want to start with Galatians 3:28, because this is kind of the one, if you start reading these debates between like egalitarian, complementarian, people are like, egalitarian, we've got Galatians 3:28. There is no difference between men and women. And let me see. I didn't even write this verse down for myself, so let me pull it up. And so I want you to see what he's saying, and we'll try to put it a little bit more in context here, because I don't think it's that strong. If we drop back to 26, so in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So it seems like the core message of the letter to the Galatians is about leaving behind a version of Judaism or of following God that kept people separated into categories and kept those people apart from each other. And so Paul, while we think of Galatians as a book where he's negative about the law, the Old Testament law, he's not negative about the rules against things like sexual immorality or idolatry or witchcraft. If we look in chapter 5 of Galatians, he's like, those things will keep you out of God's kingdom. Like, this is not, he's not worried about the moral parts of the law. But it does seem like he has great concern with the parts of the law that kept Jews and Gentiles apart, the things that separated Jews and Gentiles from each other. And that's where this whole discussion kind of starts. In chapter 1 and 2, he starts by telling this story of his relationship with the Apostle Peter and how the gospel that Paul was teaching was originally accepted by Peter, but then he had to publicly rebuke Peter on the basis of it. That Peter came and started separating from the Gentiles again, and Paul's like, I stood up in front of everyone and rebuked him. I'm like, this is a bold move from this guy that he's like, yeah, I'm also an apostle, even though I never, saw Jesus with any of you or watched anything. And he's like, and I'm going to call you to task for it. And so if you ignore the numbering, sometimes we read this, again, it's like we think that his discussion of rebuking Peter ends when the next heading is inserted by the NIV translators. It doesn't. You got to watch Paul and let his language tell you when he's transitioning to a new topic. And so this is actually the whole discussion of most of the letter. And so we're kind of still in the middle of this whole thing when we get to 3:28. And what Paul is saying here is that none of these distinctions matter. And he's probably, in large part, echoing the prophet Joel, who Peter quotes back in Acts 2 on Pentecost, right? That all flesh is going to receive the Spirit. The sons and the daughters, even slaves, are going to receive the Spirit. And Paul's like, that's what happened, Peter, right? And the old distinctions don't matter anymore. You know that. And on this basis, it's clear that Gentiles could be leaders in the church. And we see, as we read more, especially about early church history and some of the indications in the letters, that slaves were leaders in the early church. And so our question is just this, whether this third distinction of men and women matters in a way that those others don't. And it's possible that it does. I don't think that this passage is meant to erase all distinctives between men and women. I think that would be a misuse of that. And I think you'll see as we read on that Paul does imagine that some things are going to look different. It's okay for women to dress like women and men to dress like men, and we don't all have to sort of be androgynous in the church. Just the same way he was fine. If you go to a passage like Romans 14 and 15, you'll see that he's fine with the church meeting, and like the Jews still keep most of the food laws, and the Gentiles don't. And he's like, you got to learn to respect each other. We're not going to force one group to act like the other. It's okay for you to maintain some distinctives as long as you understand that you're not judging each other based on those things. Okay, so let's look at the next two. The next two are from 1 Corinthians. In chapters 11 to 14 in 1 Corinthians the larger context is their assemblies. He's going to address three different issues that happen in the gathering of Christians. And if you go back, the first few chapters of 1 Corinthians, all the way through chapter 6, Paul is addressing things he's heard about. He tells us in chapter 1 that he got news of what was going on in their church from some in Chloe's household. I don't know exactly where Chloe is, but she's wealthy enough that she has servants moving between where Paul is and Corinth. And so he's getting news about this stuff. So he addresses a bunch of things, just kind of butting into their business. But then in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, now for the matters you wrote about. So the rest of the letter, he's responding to a letter that they've sent him. And in this whole section, we're going to find that the first section, which is actually the one we're going to look at today, mostly, he says he's praising them for the way they're doing this. So he's got one issue that he's like, yeah, you're doing a great job on this. And then he has two issues where he's like, he has a big problem with them and the way they're doing church. So the first one is this whole head covering section. And so let me read it real fast just so it's kind of fresh in our minds. This section really starts with verse 2. This is where our numbering gets off. It's very clear if you read this that verse 1 goes with chapters 8 to 10. It's the end of that. And so a lot of times now they've moved the heading down after verse 1. So he says, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. So you hear him praising them, right? He says, but I want you to realize. So there's something, he's praising them, but he wants them to know or understand something. I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It's the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it's her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. Okay. It's a bizarre passage. And as I've studied this over the years, and I've read a lot of commentaries on this, and I've read a lot of more general commentaries on, the New Testament, it seems like everyone agrees that there is no harder passage to translate in the New Testament that's longer than like a sentence. That they don't really know what he's even talking about. And so if you take time, it's easy on our phones now, and go read this in like 10 different translations, you will see how many different choices they're making. And so let me kind of just highlight some translation issues. Number one, they don't know what he's talking about, because what he literally says in the Greek is that men should not have down the head and that women should have down the head. And so everyone's kind of like, I feel like we're missing a noun. Like, have what down the head? And so some of the translations are going to take the approach of the one we just did, that there's some sort of a covering they're talking about, a veil or something like that. Others take the view that he's talking about hair length throughout the whole passage, that their hair needs to go down. He clearly is referencing hair for both men and women in some places, but it's not clear that that's what he's talking about the whole time, right? So there's a confusing thing here. But also don't miss, often when this passage gets kind of talked about, we tend to kind of, and we do this with a number of these passages, we focus a lot on the instructions for the women and sort of ignore that there are explicit instructions for the men here too. He has concerns for both the men and the women doing things a certain way here. A second translation challenge that we have, and this is a big one throughout 1 Corinthians, is that we know they wrote him a letter. We know that he's responding to that. But the Greek manuscripts that we have don't have any punctuation. And it actually becomes kind of a challenge at times. There's no periods. There's no clarity of exactly when sentences end or whether it was a question. That's just not the way their language worked. And so we also don't have any quotation marks. So Paul may be quoting them at times, and this happens a lot throughout this letter, where Paul will sort of say something, and then he seems to say the opposite the next thing. And so one of the core questions that translators have is Paul saying something and then qualifying it, or is he quoting them and then disagreeing with them? And that's kind of a challenging thing. That's like, we don't even know that. We don't know what he's talking about, and we don't know which of these lines might be their thoughts on this matter that he doesn't really agree with. Because he doesn't have a problem with what they're doing, remember. He seems to have a problem with how they're thinking about it. They're missing something here. So Paul will say things, there's this line of like, yep, women came from men. But then Paul's like, it's like, yeah, that's Eve. But like every other man has come from a woman. Right? So you've got some challenges there. Another one that's tricky is this wives versus women. In the Greek, there's not, these are the same word. And so, again, if you read a bunch of translations, you'll find that some translations are they don't say man is the head of woman, they say the husband is the head of the wife. And so there's only one word for wife and women. And you have to kind of know by context which one you're dealing with. There are words for virgins or like younger women. There's a word for widows. But there's not just like a generic woman word separate from wife. And that has been a big deal. I mean, you can think, if we look, for example, at the Catholic Church, you see that unmarried women who devote themselves to the Lord actually have a lot more ministry freedom than married women in the church. So this has been a part of the tradition that there's something in entering into marriage or something that could restrict you, because this word is like the wife-woman word. So that's a confusing one. And some of these, it would be like if you look back at this, where he says man is the head of woman. Well, if that's an authority thing, and we'll talk about that in a second, it would make more sense if he's talking about like the husband is the head of his wife versus any man in this room is the head of any woman that they encounter. Right? So it seems like the husband-wife translation might make it causes less problems, let's say it that way, and is more consistent with other things we see in Scripture. Because of the angels, what a bizarre thing. Angels, women, are you worried about how the angels think about your hair today? Has anyone been thinking about that? Again, this is one of those, some people look back and say there's something weird there in angels' care. Other people say, like, this word angel is just the word messenger. It would be the same thing as if they, sent a letter by messenger across the town. It's just usually clear in the text whether we're talking about like one of God's messengers or a human one. And so again, sometimes people are looking at this and saying like, oh, I don't think the angels care what the women are wearing. But because there were no church buildings, because the church is having to meet in public areas and even in the homes of their wealthiest members, maybe you remember what those big squares, that Roman homes looked like. It's that people are coming and going. They're passing in the street, and you've got this new movement. And what does it look like when we're worshiping? So it may just be something that simple, that they're saying, like, operate with propriety, because other people are seeing what's happening here. And Paul definitely seems concerned at a lot of points in his letters with how the church appears to people outside. We're not going to cause needless offense. Okay, and then the last one, last translation issue I have time for at least, is just head. What does this mean? When we talk in a linguistic terms, words have what we call like a semantic range. Like this word can mean all of these different things. So I always use the example of ball. It's like a ball can be like a children's toy. It can be anything spherical. It can be a big party where we dance. We talk about like Cinderella going to the ball. I could say I'm having a ball, which is probably related to the party thing, but no one thinks if I say, oh, I had a ball at that I threw a dance party. It's just like, no, I was having fun. So we have all these different kinds of meanings, and 99 times out of 100, we know exactly which meaning someone is referring to, just from context of the sentence or whatever. And then we might use humor, like puns and things like that, to play on, two or more of those meanings. But we would still get that. Unless you're like one of those dense people that doesn't get the pun, right? But our problem is head for us means, it can mean like my physical head, right? And lots of things have a physical head. We also use it to mean sort of like the tip or top of something, the head of a pin or the head of a pimple or the head, it's like we kind of know there's no brain in that, but it's there at the tip of it. We use it to mean a word around authority, right? So if I said I'm the head librarian, you would sort of know like the other librarians answer to me, right? I'm the boss librarian. And then we also use it to mean source or something. So people talk about the head of a river or something where things flow from. In the Greek, the semantic range for this word head, kephale, is really basically the same in English. So it can mean source, it can mean a physical, mammal or living creature's head. It can mean, like the top of something, and it can mean authority. And the context here doesn't give us a lot to go on because he's clearly talking about physical heads because he talks about hair. He definitely has sources in mind, right? He's talking about women coming from men or men coming from women. Who's the source of who? That kind of thing. And he specifically mentions authority. He uses that word talking about that the woman has to have authority over her own head. So at least all three possible main meanings are present in the passage, and so it doesn't give us a lot of guidance. But I think what we see in all of this is, a confusing passage. But I want to center back on verse 3 briefly, because I think it's key. He says, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And then he goes on. Like, that's the basis of everything else. And I think sometimes we drop that off. And so he may be doing something like this. He says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But he's just told you, I think he's using the word in two ways. Is it the authority way or the source way? Unclear. Does God have authority over Christ in the same way that Christ has authority over men? Does Christ have authority over men but only through women, or over women but only through men? Like, that kind of creates issues. The source thing maybe makes slightly more sense. We do have this sense that Jesus came from the Father, that the Father was the one who sent him, and so that could make more sense with the source. But he also submits to the Father. Not my will, but your will be done. So we've got a lot. It's like maybe he's even sort of playing on all three. But notice what he says. You need to understand that Christ is the head of the man. And so the man cannot pray with his head covered, because who's his head? Who? Christ, right? And so if he covers his head, he's trying to approach God without Jesus. But a woman must cover her head, because who's her head? The man, or her husband, because she does not approach Christ through her husband. She has to approach Christ directly in order to get to God as well. So it may be something like that he's like, this symbolism reminds us that even though we have this like order of creation and this source, that we each, men and women, go to Christ. Something like that. But even if we take this headship language as meaning authority, I think we have to just remember that Jesus' headship, his authority over us, is not exerted by giving lots of commands to us. Most of us wish Jesus would just tell us what to do a whole lot more, right? His headship is exerted through his self-sacrificing example. Even his one new command, right? A new command I give you, just has his example as our new reference. You just love like I love. That's the command. Just kind of act like me. And so it's sad to me that we often, both men and women, in so many areas of life, fall back into, what Jesus said, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, but not so among you, right? We just kind of want to lord it over people. I do think it's clear in the language that she has to have authority over her own head, and that's in the Greek. There are some translations that'll say a sign of authority. There's no sign of in the Greek language. That's just people kind of like trying to make sense of it. Probably he means that she has the authority to pray and prophesy in the assembly when she's wearing the proper covering. So that's what the whole text seems to be about. And then there's also some challenging cultural issues here. We have examples from the time period. There are some statues of Augustus Caesar when he's functioning as the Pontifex Maximus, like the high priest, and is doing his like high priestly duties. In all of those statues and reliefs, he has his toga flipped up and has covered his head. And so there may be something here that it's like in pagan worship, the men cover their heads and the women do not, and we do that the opposite. But there's also, it does seem like married women would wear some sort of a veil or head covering, that was a part of like appearing as a matron in public, that young unmarried women would not. And so it may just be a propriety thing. But the only really clear thing, so I'm like, now that I've confused you thoroughly about this passage, the only really clear thing is that Paul expected women to prophesy in the assembly. That's like the only one clear takeaway. And prophecy, as we'll see in the same letter in the following chapters, 12 to 14, is what Paul thinks as the most important and valuable speaking role. I mean, that's the point he's going to make in chapters 12 to 14. He says it's for strengthening, encouraging, and comforting the other people, the other believers. He says it's for unbelievers to understand and be convicted of sin, that has an evangelistic thrust. He says in verse 31 of chapter 14 that it's for learning and being instructed. So we need to let this same letter and what Paul's talking about interpret it for us. Well, that takes us to chapter 14. And so let's read real fast. I'm running out of time. Here we go. Go down to verse 34. Here's a tricky one. 14:34. Women should remain silent in the churches. They're not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it's disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Okay, so again, we've got some challenges here. The first thing I would just say is look at your footnote here, whatever you've got, because this is also a very unique passage. These two verses, they're in all of our manuscripts that we have, but they're not in the same place in the Eastern and Western traditions. And so the Eastern tradition, which is not the one we tend to follow, actually has these same verses, but they're at the end of the chapter. And if you read everything, like read through 33 and then start in 36, you'll see that it flows more naturally in a lot of ways. So there are people who don't think this is a part of the original text, that it's some sort of an add-on that got inserted in different places in different manuscript traditions. That's a whole argument you can go read and study about if you would like to. I think what we have here, and I wish we had time to read all of chapter 14, because chapter 14 is all about interrupting each other in the assembly. And so he talks about these people speaking in tongues and how they need to take turns. And if you speak in a tongue, you don't get to speak in a tongue unless there's an interpreter there, and you do it one at a time, back to back. And if you don't, what's interesting is the translations, this phrase here where he says that the women need to keep silent, this is the same word that he uses in verses 28 and 30 when he tells these other prophets and people to keep silent, except most of the English translations don't translate it the same all three times. And so here we have women have to keep silent. Other places it's like this one needs to sit down or needs to stop speaking or whatever. But it's the exact same word, conjugated the exact same. We have it 3 times in the chapter. And so I think each time he's addressing a certain kind of interruptions that are going on. That a prophet's up speaking, and if someone else wants to do, you don't interrupt. You give them, okay, I'll give you the time. I'll sit down and be quiet and let you speak. No one's demanding their own airtime here. That's not appropriate for Christian assembly. The same way in our setting, it wouldn't be appropriate if one of you just stood up and is like, well, I'm talking now. It's like, no, we've planned this, and this is the time that was given to me. And I think that's what's going on probably here. Again, there's this women-wives question, and this one I think is a little more clear that he does seem to be addressing wives because he references their husbands telling them something at home, right? So it's probably a more situational thing here. Remember, women in this culture were not educated at the same way, often not hardly at all. And so you've got men that know all this stuff, and there may be women who are interrupting to ask questions that he feels like that's just breaking the flow of these different people speaking, and you can get that basic information in another setting. So I think it's all about interruptions. But I definitely don't think it's about preventing women from prophesying, because it would be just sort of crazy. It's like Paul becomes this crazy person who can't remember what he wrote 5 minutes ago in chapter 11, right? It doesn't make sense. They're the third group in a row told to be silent. There's also this issue of, he says, as the law says. Well, we are so used to yes, the law is always the Old Testament law, but you'll notice, in the NIV at least, law is not capitalized here, because there is nothing in the Old Testament law that says this. So either this is something where they're in generally. Now, again, this is another one of the things where some translators think he's quoting them here, and then that this entire thing is a quote from them, which would make his statement there in verse 36, did the word of God originate with you? You've added something to the law. It would kind of make his response here a little bit more indignant and irate. But there's nothing in the law, but there may have been local laws or something that we don't know about that. We certainly don't have law codes for every random city in the ancient world at every time period. We just don't know about that. But we don't know what this law is. It's not in the Old Testament. And so we have to be careful about just assuming that that's any time the word law is used, it's somehow referencing some command from God. Because no one can figure out what this would even possibly apply to. And so, if we take this section out of context and apply it literally, women couldn't have conversations when they're in the assembly. They couldn't sing the songs, etc., right? We already apply this text selectively, but often how we select is more about the ideas that we bring to the text than any that we get out of it. Because we have to make some assumptions. But again, I would say our best bet is to interpret this based on chapter 11, because those are in the same book, same context of dealing with their assemblies and that kind of thing. Okay, for sake of time, let's keep moving. 1 Timothy 2. I think the packet says 11 to 15. I would like to look at least 8 to 15. Because I think it's a part of the bigger, I gotta get here. So he says, therefore I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I also want women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. So note here, modesty is not about how much skin they're showing. It's about how much wealth they're showing off. That's the modesty issue. He says, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I don't permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Okay, so many issues. Number one, let's talk about this letter. What is 1 Timothy about? He tells us back in chapter 1, verse 3, that Paul left Timothy in Ephesus in order to stop some false teachers. I left you there to silence certain people who are teaching things. And that's an issue that goes throughout the letter. And so again, sometimes I'm growing up, it's like chapter 2, this is about church. I don't know what chapter 1's about or what chapter 3 is about. But as you read through, you find that basically every chapter of this letter is about leaders and appropriate leadership. He's addressing that from all these different angles. I think it's all one bigger context. The problem with these false teachers doesn't really seem to be any specific heretical content, but rather the uselessness of what they're teaching. And he talks about endless genealogies and old wives' tales and all that. It's like you're just talking about stuff that doesn't matter. You got to silence that and get us focused back on what's important. There does seem to be a lack of clarity around what's sinful and what's good, but not some clear, nameable heresy. And then in this one place in the middle, Paul addresses men and women separately, but I think it's still in the context of all of these issues around false teachers. This is written to Ephesus. Ephesus had the largest and oldest temple to Artemis, and that was a place where women played prominent leadership roles. And so some people think that's playing into the culture, but there's sort of a guess there. But also in this leadership context, he does address women in a number of different places. So he'll talk, in 4 verse 7 about old wives' tales, and in 5:15 he talks about widows who've turned away to follow Satan. And so you have some different issues going on throughout this letter. But most who believe that the key verse here, right, is 1 Timothy 2:12. I don't permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. I want to read this whole 8 to 15 because most who teach that is a command for all women for all time rarely bind any of the other 6 commands in that passage, including none for the men. We don't tend to restrict what women are able to wear. Even if we don't keep them quiet, or even if we keep them quiet, it's okay if you have gold jewelry on, and it's okay if you do your hair this morning, or whatever that is. And we certainly, a lot of times in our traditional churches, don't insist that our men lift their hands during prayer. We wouldn't be caught dead doing such a thing, right? And so we're like, well, those are cultural. And I'm like, well, I think we have to have a good reason. And the good reason is often this reference to Eve. The problem is it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and I'll get to that in just a second. So the Greek word, though, first, translation for authority, I don't permit a woman, here it says to assume authority over a man, is not the one that's used in other places in the Bible. In fact, this is the only time this word is used in the entire Bible. And it's this Greek word authentane. And it mainly means to domineer or thrust oneself. It usually has a negative connotation in other extra-biblical writings. It's not a neutral connotation like the general word for authority that the Bible uses in every other place. It sometimes means to kind of declare yourself the author or the originator of something. So this came from me, authentane, author, right? And that might make Paul's illustration in the next segment not an argument from the basis of creation, but rather an example of how women are not superior and can be wrong. That maybe there's something here where women are arguing all of you came from us. We're women are the source of everything. And Paul's like, well, actually, remember, something like that. There are some Gnostic teachings that we have records of a little bit later that were actually teaching that Eve was created first, and she's the one who enlightened Adam with her superior knowledge. The Gnostics were very into knowledge. And so, maybe that's something like that's the false teaching that he's going on. And it may just be sometimes I think we look at this as women are more easily deceived than men. That's kind of how people have taken this. Well, Adam wasn't deceived, Eve was. But, we know from sociological studies and stuff that, generally, in our culture at least, women are actually less easily deceived than men, though it's very close. Being deceived is, how easily deceived you are has to do with age, how sheltered your life has been, your education level. And so in a world where husbands tended to be much older, much more educated, and much more free to live their life and do their things, maybe it was a reality there. But I don't think that's what Paul's talking about. Other people have looked at this and thought, well, when you look at, and this is kind of a more complicated argument, but when you look at the Genesis account, Adam is the one who's given the command about the tree, not to eat the tree. And then Eve is made. And then the serpent comes and talks to Eve, and when he asks her about the command, she misquotes it. And so the point here may be something more along the lines of, who deceived Eve? Adam didn't teach her the correct command. She was deceived by him, not by the serpent in this thing, that she didn't know what she ought to know. So there's a lot of weird layers with this. And again, we don't have time to dig into it. But the most tricky verse, I think, is verse 15, which is that women will be saved through childbearing. And, I think we can't just say, well, that's not in line with the rest of the Bible, but we're not going to reconsider how we think about any of the other verses in this passage, right? I think probably, and I would just say childbearing and salvation are definitely not cultural issues or church-specific issues, right? These are just human issues. This might be related to this false teaching that we see in chapter 4, verse 3 later on, where people are being forbidden from marrying. And Paul may be saying something like, marriage and childbearing can be a part of following Jesus for Christian women. And I would just remind you, we're only hearing one side of a conversation here. We don't know what was going on in this church. We're just sort of guessing from context clues. But I think we need to be careful not to bind these commands on women, but decide the restrictions on men are merely cultural, unless we have really legitimate reasons to do that. The text doesn't say anything about only men holding certain offices. It doesn't say anything about women being able to teach if they're under the authority of a man. It doesn't say anything about it being okay for parachurch organizations to have women teach, right? A lot of the ways we sort of work around this stuff. The text, if we interpret it as a command for all times, would preclude women from writing books that men might read and be in danger of being taught anything by. It would preclude women from writing hymns that men could sing, like Blessed Assurance, written by a woman, because that's been one of the primary teaching tools of the church over the centuries. So I think seeing this as anything but instructions for a specific time and place actually creates so many more interpretive problems than it actually solves. And all of this kind of creates, even this, I don't permit a woman to teach, and yet in Acts we see that women in Paul's ministry did teach men, and he didn't seem to have a problem with it there. So there's something, I think, there's some other layer here we're missing. The last one I'll just briefly mention, but these in chapter 3, we've got the restrictions or the list of qualifications for eldership, for deacons, and the women. I don't have much time, but note too that we have another list of requirements for a group that's being has a specific role and support from the church in chapter 5, this order of widows. There's another layer here. In this passage, there are no masculine pronouns, and some people have looked at this and thought that's interesting, because the English tends to add them in. He needs to this, he needs to that. None of that's in the Greek. Titus 1 has a similar list like this, also no masculine pronouns there. Sometimes this husband of one wife, the Greek is very explicit. It's like one woman man, or man of one woman. And so what that one is obviously, somewhat gender specific, but some think that that's just sort of more like a term for monogamous or something like that, because they don't have a word monogamy like we have. But again, if we take it too extreme, it means that only a married man can be an overseer. But that would actually exclude Jesus and Paul. And Jesus is the only person who's named as an overseer in the entire New Testament, and he wasn't married. So most people don't take this to mean a qualification, like you have to be a one-woman man or a man of one woman, but more of a restriction or an exclusion of anyone that doesn't, has more than one woman kind of thing. Let's see. I'm over time. So yeah, reading it as a requirement creates bigger problems. And then the third one I would say is just, who are the women who are given requirements here? Because in verse 8, he's like, likewise, or depending on your translation, in the same way, the deacons. And then in verse 11, we have the exact same words, and likewise, or in the same way, the women. And so, are these wives? If they're wives, are they just the deacons' wives, or are the overseers' wives also? Some people have taken, or are these women deacons? But then why doesn't he use that word? Are they gender-specific requirements, for anyone in these roles? Because to some degree, the men's roles seem to be paired with like the way men live in their society. We also get these, like I said, requirements for women widows who are on the payroll of the church later. So, and then the last thing I would say too is Titus 1 creates some interesting things because we get only a list for overseers there. It's very similar, but not the exact same list. And so it kind of also raises this issue of like, is this really some sort of a timeless list of like, if you check these 5 boxes, you can be an overseer forever? If so, why does he not use the same 5 boxes in the 2 places he gives it? My church growing up, we're like, well, we got to add the 2 boxes together because God gave us a puzzle, and that's our job, is to be like puzzleologists. And it's like, I don't think that's what he's doing. I think he's addressing the situations here. But again, that's a challenging one. Okay, so again, we could talk 2 more hours about these passages. It gives us a muddy picture. That's the bottom line. This whole thing gives us a muddy picture. But God seems okay with the mess. He seems okay with the mess. And I think we're left with some core questions of like, what is this thing that we're doing? Is it a rules thing or is it a Holy Spirit thing? I think we see in Acts, when we read this story of the early church, God just does stuff and people are left to sort of figure out what to do with what God did. And it seems like the early apostles would have loved a lot more explanations, like Gentiles can be Christians and they don't have to get circumcised. They're like, no, we're going to have to like argue about that and have a conference, and Paul's going to rebuke Peter over it and all this. It's like if God was trying to make it so nailed down, he's really bad at it. But I don't believe God's bad at anything. And so I think we have to take seriously the way he does this, that it's the way he wants it done. And so I see, I don't want to empower all women to do anything any more than I want to empower all men to do anything or to fill any role, right? We want to empower people to do what the Spirit has gifted them to do. I think it seems strange for God to gift a bunch of women with gifts they're not supposed to use. And like he's trying to trick us. And I'm like, I don't think that's what's going on here. But with that said, I would say these are tricky passages. And so, I have no stones to throw for people that come with a wide range of conclusions. I think we have to decide in any given congregation, how are we going to do this? The same way as any family, you got to decide when can they start dating, when can they get a phone, when can they, what's curfew going to be? It's like there's no right or wrong. There's just our answer to these questions. And those who live in this household are bound by those decisions. We honor our father and mother. And so you guys have to decide as a church family, what are we going to do? And what's that going to look like? And then we abide by that when we live in it. But the thing that I've started using is, in our legal system, we have 2 standards of evidence, right? In a criminal trial, you have to convince the jury that they're guilty. Remember what it is? Beyond a reasonable doubt. No reasonable person would think they were innocent, right? But in a civil trial, it's a preponderance of the evidence. That's all it is. That's why O.J. Simpson can be found innocent in his criminal trial and then guilty in his civil trial. There's 2 different things. It's like the evidence sort of tilted over on this side overall. But a reasonable person might think it didn't happen, And obviously there are two different juries, but still. And I just tell people, I'm like, I am not egalitarian beyond a reasonable doubt. I totally understand. They're very reasonable doubts. It goes back to the assumptions we make and that we bring to scriptures and the things that, I think people have to be really legitimate with that. But when I take what Mark taught and all of what I'm looking at and how difficult these passages are in the context of these letters, I do think the evidence tilts towards God moving in this direction. And so I'll close there. That's kind of where I'm at. You want me to pray? Yeah. God, I just pray that you help us to take seriously your word always, and to always be ready for you to convince us that we're wrong, that we could repent, and that we could get more on board with what you're doing. In Jesus' name, amen.